Good evening, and welcome to the meeting of the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. I'm Rich Rosenthal. I'm the president of the organization. A 2-minute commercial of who we are. We're one of the largest roundtables, and we're known for the caliber of our speakers and our membership participants. We stress the military, socio-economic aspects of the Civil War and its lasting legacy. Some of the speakers who appeared before our group include 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. James McPherson, we honored him at a dinner. He actually spoke 3 times. Eric Foner, Civil War icon Ed Bars, Andy Wesky, of course, Professor Murray, of course, New Jersey historian John T. Cunningham, Rutgers Professor Louis Mazer, Lincoln. We had S.C. Gwynn, Craig Simons, honored also at our dinner, James Bud Robertson, Thomas Fleming, and preeminent Lincoln scholar Michael Burlingame. And next month we'll have Jeff Hunt coming in again. We are a member of the color bearer level of the American Battlefield Trust. We present annual awards at New Jersey History Day at William Patterson in honor of our member, distinguished author, Emmy winner, John T. Cunningham. And quite a number of our winners went on to nationals and did very well there. We present an annual book award, and we're going to resume it again because, as of COVID, but we did give it to Professor Mazer, and the 2019 winner was Columbia University Professor Andrew Del Banco for The War Before the War. Jay Maloney is on, but we are the only Civil War roundtable to present an annual Civil War legal presentation composed of distinguished judges and attorneys. And attorneys who are members of our roundtable are invited to be panelists of this. That's something that's for our members. But, obviously it's gotten nationwide attention. And last year, the program became a Civil War, CLE, Continuing Legal Education Program. So we heard it for free, and the attorneys pay $200. When they took the course. We have a members-only book group. It's only just for our members, and it's not a book of the month, but it is. We start going into a book, and then we just have the discussion as long as it lasts. This was unique to us. We were the sponsors of Medicinal Plants of the Civil War Garden, which was at the Frelinghuysen Arboretum. And because of Zoom, we now have members from 11 states, including Barry Crompton, who you see over here, from Australia, who's one of our members. All of our meetings, unfortunately, now have to be on Zoom. We got members from 11 states, and Dickie Lulayan lives in California, will not drive to a meeting, nor will Rick Davis from Wyoming. That's supposed to be funny. It's not. And here's the thing, as our public service, all our programs are being supplied to public libraries at no request. Some of the libraries who are carrying our program tonight are from New Jersey, Chester, Kemmerer Library in Harding Township, the Parsippany Library, and Gene Embler was on before, Roxbury, Rockaway Township, Drakehausen, forgive me if I forgot to list the other names. This offer is made to any library, anywhere. What's the difference? It's on Zoom, and we don't ask for the address of the library, rather. We don't want they do the links, they send it out to themselves. We are, although we're nonprofit, we're not a fundraising organization. Our dues are nominal of $39 a year, and if anybody wants to join us to help support our programs, you're more than welcome to join us. One more thing before I do go off, mention this. A number of people tonight who have a Comcast address have asked me for the email address today, and I looked, and I know I sent it out. So I'm going to have to somehow, for Comcast, I have to create a separate list. If they're in the middle of other names, Comcast is turning it down. It wasn't a question of 1 or 2, but I got a half a dozen people who said I didn't receive the link. So I'll have to work out something with Comcast. Okay, that was that. Professor Murray is back, and we're last month we had 120 participants, and last year she had the same number. Professor Murray is a military historian with a specialization in the American Civil War in the Department of History at Oklahoma State University. Murray's most recent publication, On a Great Battlefield, The Making of Management and Memory of Gettysburg National Military Park, 1933 to 2013. She's also a member of the Civil War Begins, published by the United States Army Center of Military History in 2012. She is, oh, this is, we got dibs on this one. She's currently working on a full-length biography of George Gordon Meade. And when it's published, I'm jumping in. We're first. And we will at any time, I don't care, through that. Okay, in addition to delivering hundreds of Civil War battlefield tours, she's led World War I and World War II study abroad trips to Europe. And she's a veteran faculty member at Gettysburg's Civil War Institute and a coveted speaker at Civil War symposiums and roundtables. Absolutely. She worked as a seasonal interpretive park ranger for the National Park Service at Gettysburg National Military Park for 9 summers. You were there this year. It gives me a great privilege to present Dr. Jennifer Murray. You're on.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and do my screen share, and the technology should be working smoothly. And you all now should be able to see my PowerPoint. I'm going to put it in presentation mode. There we are. Great. Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to your group again. I talked with you all in January, it was last month, on Meade and the Overland Campaign. So what I had planned to do this evening, after emailing back and forth with Rich, thinking about some topics, is sort of continuing the story where we left off from last month when we talked about Meade and his role in the Overland Campaign, just moving the narrative forward. So hopefully you'll see some logic to this, and you'll continue to follow Meade's odyssey through 1864. And specifically, what I want to do tonight is look at his leadership in the early phases to capture Petersburg. And I'll say, too, before I move on to my first slide, the Petersburg Campaign, and hopefully you get a sense of this tonight as I walk through this talk with you over the course of the next hour, is an incredibly underappreciated campaign. The historians, the scholarship, so much has been written on battles like Gettysburg and Antietam and Vicksburg, less on the Overland Campaign. Gordon Ray's work is really masterful and unsurpassed on the Overland Campaign. And then when we get to Petersburg, the scholarship really is quite scant. Some of you might have Will Green's book on Petersburg. It's called A Campaign of Giants. And that's to be a trilogy. So the first part of it has been out for probably a decade or so now. And it's the best work we have on Petersburg. He's working on the 2nd and 3rd volume now. And then we have Richard Summers' big book on Petersburg too. But really beyond that, our field needs some scholarly, masterful works on Petersburg. And as we'll see, it's an enormous complex campaign, and one that we as Civil War historians and Civil War students and enthusiasts would do well to appreciate a little bit more. So all that to say, what I want to do tonight is situate General Meade in this long and complex campaign to capture Petersburg. This is the very last slide that I showed you last month when I talked to you about the Overland Campaign. And we ended thinking of the consequences of the Overland Campaign, the 6 weeks of fighting that cost the Army of the Potomac 55,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. And I hope if I did a good job in conveying that information last month, hopefully you walked away from your computer with a better, deeper appreciation of George Meade's role in the Overland Campaign. He is absolutely active and involved in the Overland Campaign from the Wilderness through Cold Harbor, absolutely tactically, strategically, and operationally in charge of the Army of the Potomac, without a doubt. So now The Army of the Potomac will be crossing the James River. The Overland Campaign comes to an end, and we're going to kick off the Petersburg Campaign. I thought that it would be useful to give you a broad overview, all on one slide, of what the Petersburg Campaign is for the U.S. Army. Armies, plural. So I've kind of itemized it for us here. The Petersburg Campaign lasts 292 days. 292 days from mid-June until the second day of April. Mid-June 1864, the second day of April 1865. It is the longest campaign operation in the American Civil War, and we could also argue convincingly it's the most complicated. I've only put on Union offensives on this slide. Of course, I'm studying Meade, I'm studying the Union Army, and historians look at Petersburg in 9 phases or 9 offensives. And you can see them on my PowerPoint slide. What I want to do tonight to make this digestible, and thinking of the time we have, I want to focus on the first 3. So I want to work with you on June of 1864, the first offensive, the second offensive, and then we're going to close out our program tonight on the third offensive, which, if you're looking at the chronology, you'll recognize the third offensive to be the iconic assault at the crater. So we're going to work through the first 3. First, we need to get the Army of the Potomac across the James River. So Federal soldiers will begin crossing over the James River and establishing a position on the south bank of the James in mid-June, the 14th, 15th, and 16th. This is a sketch, of course, of Lieutenant General Grant overseeing or overlooking some of that crossing. It's a masterful operation in of itself to get an army across the James River. Grant will cross the James River on June 15th around noon, and he will head to City Point, where he will make his headquarters for about the balance of the war. And I'll show you a photograph of Grant's headquarters on my next slide. Meade will cross the James River on June 16th, in the morning on the 16th. But before we get too deep into the weeds, and maybe because Petersburg is this more unfamiliar or kind of ambiguous campaign for us, I thought it would be useful to just throw this map in here early. It's shows us some of the reasons why Petersburg is important. So much time, manpower, supplies, and efforts are going to be invested in this Virginia city. So understanding why it's important helps us think about these campaigns and Meade's role in them. Petersburg is 22 miles south of Richmond, capital of the Confederacy. So Grant's aspirations to capture Richmond through the Overland Campaign are halted, as we looked at last month. And now the idea is to get to Richmond from the south. But to get to Richmond from the south, you're going to have to deal with Petersburg. Logistically, Petersburg is important because it sits at the confluence of the Appomattox River, which you can see running right through the middle part of the map, and the James River. Logistically, Petersburg is important because it's a nexus for major railroad traffic. And you can see those marked on the map. The South Side River, the Weldon, South Side Railroad, the Weldon Railroad. You can see the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad on the right corner of the map. You can see the Petersburg and City Point Railroad more to the middle right top of the map. This is an absolute hub of logistics. The railroads, the rivers make Petersburg figure so prominently in this final phase of the war. Now, since we're looking at this map, take a look at what will become a signature part of the Petersburg Campaign. The fortifications marked here in the pink, the Confederate line in the red on the east side of Petersburg. And then for our story, we're going to focus on the Union role. Take a look at the blue, the markations of the particular corps in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, and their efforts to capture Petersburg, smash through those entrenched lines coming in from the east, moving east to west. The first Union, so as a point of context, the first Union soldiers to threaten Petersburg are going to be from Baldy Smith's Corps, the 18th Corps, General Smith, which you can see at the top of the map, and Winfield Scott Hancock and the 2nd Corps. And they're going to make, across the James, the initial thrust or threaten movement into Petersburg. And that's going to lead us to the first offensive of Petersburg. This is a photograph, a wartime image of Grant's headquarters at City Point, the confluence of the Appomattox and the James. Overwhelmingly, this is where Grant will spend the majority of his time. It allows him to oversee operations not only of Meade and the Army of the Potomac, but also the Army of the James, and in due time, the federal efforts in the Shenandoah Valley under the command of Philip Sheridan. So mostly it's about 8 miles from where Meade will be in the lines at Petersburg, which gives, again, Meade a tremendous amount of autonomy in these operations at Petersburg. So if there's one big point that I desperately, profoundly hope that you come away from last month and tonight, it's putting Meade in his rightful place at the center of these operations. He is not a secondary figure. He's not a tertiary figure. He is absolutely actively involved in managing the fight around this Cockade city, Petersburg, Virginia. So I mentioned that Meade crosses the James on the 16th. He's going to board a steamer. Theodore Lyman, his aide, and some others will cross with him. And he's now on the south side of the James River. The first thing that he does is ride to find Grant. He rides over to City Point. Grant is not there at that particular time. Grant is out sort of surveying the lines. And Meade will run into Grant as Grant is returning to his headquarters at City Point. And they have a quick conversation where Grant will convey to Meade his desire for the Union soldiers to assault Petersburg. And the reason that Grant wants an attack to be made, this is June 16th, is because he thinks that Baldy Smith, specifically the 18th Corps, is really poised to capture Petersburg, with the 2nd Corps moving in support. So Grant will give instructions to Meade. I want an attack to be made at 6 o'clock. Meade understands his objective. Meade's going to ride to where the Union Army is taking its position. He will get about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to the federal lines at Petersburg. Now, keep in mind, this is sort of equivalent to Meade coming to Gettysburg. You know, this moment is incredibly important. He's never seen the ground at Petersburg in his life. He's completely unfamiliar with the topography, the position of the Confederates, how well they're dug in, what the Union Army, it's arriving in piecemeal, what their strength is like, what their lines are going to be like. And now he's tasked with orchestrating an assault. This will be the first offensive at Petersburg. So Meade will go out with his chief of staff, General Andrew Humphreys, and he'll go out with his 2nd Corps commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, and they will conduct a reconnaissance of the enemy position. And the enemy position, you might be familiar with the Dimmock Line, is the namesake of the Dimmock Line comes from Captain Charles Dimmock. And he has been tasked in the winter of 1862 with protecting Petersburg. By the time the Union Army is on the gates of Petersburg here in June of 64, the Dimmock Line is 10 miles. And I'll just flip back to the map for a second. Look at how Petersburg is situated south of the Appomattox River. So when these armies dig in, they use the Appomattox River to protect their flanks. So the Confederates have dug in such that their left flank rests on the Appomattox River. Then they run their entrenchments just around the city in the shape of a big lazy U, so that their right flank then would rest on the Appomattox River. You rest your flanks on the river. So we have 10 miles.
Flanks.
10 miles. Oops, wrong one. Went one too far. Rest your flanks on the Appomattox River, and we have 10 miles of entrenchments, 55 Confederate artillery batteries. This is PGT Beauregard is in command of this particular part of Virginia. I'll show you a photo of him in a minute, a name I'm sure you're all familiar with. But the problem the Confederates have, and this is why these assaults at Petersburg are so interesting, particularly the first offensive, is that Army Northern Virginia isn't yet slid into these entrenchments. PGT Beauregard is tasked with serving and protecting Petersburg, holding the Dimmock Line with about 2,200 men. So
Wow.
the moment here is particularly timely. Like, there is a window of opportunity for the Union forces to strike Petersburg and capture the city, right? Wreck the supplies, move up perhaps into Richmond. It is an auspicious moment. So the way the assault works out on June 16 is Meade does what Grant wants, makes an attack at 6 o'clock. He uses 3 corps. Meade will coordinate with Hancock, the 2nd Corps, which I mentioned, Baldy Smith, the 18th Corps, which we mentioned, and then Meade is also going to pluck Ambrose Burnside and the 9th Corps to operate in support. Union artillery opened fire at 6 o'clock. It kicks off the first day of the first offensive at Petersburg, and Meade is active. This is Horace Porter. Some of you might have his recollections, his account campaigning with Grant. One of Grant's staff officers will write about Meade on the 16th, and he says that Meade, in his usual nervous energy, was displayed in intensity of his manner and the rapid, animated style of his conversation. So Meade's out riding, actively coordinating the attacks of these 3 Union corps. And he's able to put about 50,000 men together to strike the position that Beauregard has had reinforcements, numbers about 14,000 men. And on the 16th of June, at the end of the day, the 2nd Corps achieves some breakthrough. Francis Barlow's division particularly will perform very well, but they are unable to break and penetrate in a real meaningful, lasting way the Dimmock Line. They have captured about 500 prisoners, 3 Confederate artillery batteries, but the Dimmock Line, that image of those Confederate soldiers in the entrenchments I showed you 2 slides ago, has held. This is going to be the lesson learned, the perpetual quest and objective through the entirety of the Petersburg Campaign. 292 days. How can the Union Army break the enemy's position that is so very well dug in? How do you break an entrenched position that will allow you to exploit it and secure the objective? That is the elusive quest for the next 9 months. So the 16th is relatively limited gains. And if you looked at the numbers there, the Confederates couldn't, the Confederates held a position against overwhelming odds. Overwhelming odds. That, of course, is PGT Beauregard. So Meade reports this back to Grant and at City Point. And then the question is going to be, do we continue to press the Confederate line at Petersburg? And in his message back to Grant at City Point, as he's explaining the fighting and the outcome on the 16th, Meade will also add that my men are tired. The reality of the Overland Campaign, the Army of the Potomac, is exhausted. And he says this to Grant. These attacks have not been made with the vigor and force which characterized our fighting in the wilderness. Early May. So much has happened since then. But Meade promises, I'll continue to press the enemy's position. Throughout the 16th and into the 17th, even the 18th, the Union Army, more corps will trickle into position. And specifically, this is the same map that I just showed you a couple slides back. Specifically now, the 18th Corps, the Army of the James, the 2nd Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock, now the 5th Corps has arrived. Governor K. Warren has arrived, and you can see on the map, the 5th Corps extends the Union line, taking a position on the Army of the Potomac's left. So with the addition of Warren and the 5th Corps, Meade feels in a position on the 17th of June to try to break Beauregard's line again. So this is all first offensive, the first Union offensive at Petersburg. So on June 17, what Meade plans for is another massive frontal assault against the Confederate position. This time, Meade decides to use the 9th Corps, General Burnside's corps, to spearhead the attack. And Burnside's divisions, the two men in the image here, Robert Potter, General Potter on the left, General James Ledlie, who we'll see them both later when we talk about the crater, are going to spearhead the 9th Corps infantry assault. The attack on the 17th will begin about 4 o'clock in the morning. So this idea may be to catch the Confederates off and by surprise, use that to your advantage. And like we saw the day before, the Union forces have some success. Specifically, the 9th Corps achieves a bit of a breakthrough on the Confederate line, but they're not able to hold it or exploit it in any meaningful way. This is a Forbes sketch of the fighting around Petersburg. Specifically, he's capturing a scene on June 15th, but I'm using it to be sort of representative of what the fighting would have been like on the 16th or 17th. And you can see the Federal soldiers here moving forward, attacking an entrenched position. And I think you can pretty easily appreciate the courage, the sacrifice, and ultimately the futility of this. But again, opportunity here, this opening few days south of the James, is absolutely important because the Army in Northern Virginia, Lee, his army, has not yet arrived in strength, in force to Petersburg. So if the Federals have a chance to do anything, their window of opportunity is now, because their manpower advantage, their numbers, their strength is so disparate. It is so greater than what the Confederates have under Beauregard's command. So on June 17, the 9th Corps attacks. They perform well by and large, have some initial breakthrough, like I mentioned. They will get some reinforcement from the 2nd Corps, Warren, who just arrived, the 5th Corps, and Baldy Smith in the 18th Corps. I mean, Meade's really pulling in troops from every part of the army available to him. But they are not able to marshal that numerical superiority and break the Confederate line. And at the end of the day, I threw this on the slide to just sort of let this magnitude sit in. 2 Confederate divisions will repulse 3 coordinated assaults from the 9th, 2nd, 5th, and 18th Corps. That shows us the power of entrenchments and fortifications. Actually, right before this Zoom call, I have my U.S. military history class meets on Thursday evenings, and we're just about to start our World War I segment. I was talking about trench warfare with them. So the futility of attacking these positions does not change from 1864 to 1917. So 2 days of effort, 2 days of trying to coordinate an attack across a broad front hasn't brought the Union Army any success. It hasn't brought Meade that moment, that culminating moment, to have Petersburg in his grasp. Later that night, Meade will write a letter to his wife, Margaret, June 17th, talking about the fighting now south of the James. And it's a relatively lengthy letter. He writes to her in part. He says, I reached the field yesterday, having been placed by General Grant in command of all the troops in front of Petersburg, consisting of the Army of the Potomac, 2 portions of Butler's army. Grant is back at City Point. I like this quote because Meade is conveying to his wife his autonomy in command. I'm placed in command of all the troops around Petersburg by Grant. Grant's back at City Point. He's 8 miles away. These are my operations. So he's not secondary, not tertiary. These are his fights. And then last month, I talked to you all about Meade's row with Edward Crapsey, the Philadelphia Inquirer correspondent, who writes a somewhat inflammatory account on Meade's conduct at the Wilderness. And he says, Meade's so dissatisfied with it, he brings Crapsey in and expels him from the army in a particularly humiliating way. Meade's still thinking a lot about this Crapsey incident. He will gripe at length about the injustice done to him by Crapsey and how he's portrayed in the Northern media. And I say that just to give you a sense of all these factors in play in Meade's mind. The operations in front of Petersburg obviously consuming his attention, but still on the night of the 17th, other things are still going on in the commanding general's mind, occupying emotional attention for him. Perhaps you could argue in an unhealthy way. Day 3 now. June 16, 17, 18. We're into day 3. One more effort Meade's going to make to strike and break the Confederate line. And this is also fueled by the arrival of more troops, federal troops, extending the line at Petersburg. And now these are men from the 6th Corps coming. This is General Neal's division, Horatio Wright's Corps. And the numbers are really sort of disparate on how many men Meade has available to him. Will Green, and in his writing, puts it at a range of 63,000 to 83,000 federal soldiers. So even on the smaller, more conservative side of that, 63,000, the federal soldiers outnumber their enemy about 4 to 1. So again, timing, opportunity here is important. Much like the day before, Meade wants a coordinated attack between multiple corps, 2nd, 5th, 6th, and then this portion of with Neal with the 6th cooperating with the 9th. Much like has been Meade's command style since he took command of the Army of the Potomac, but really since he joined the war in August of '61 as a brigade commander, Meade is active and leading from the front. He very much is in command and control of these days' fights. I give you an example again from Horace Porter. He writes about Meade on the 18th, saying that Meade's running up and down the line with all these dispatches. He's pacing up and down the field. He's nervous, restless, watching the progress of the operations. He made running comments on the action of his subordinates. Then, whenever Meade gets a little frustrated with the performance or how the progress of the battle is unfolding, Porter recalls that Meade falls into, quote, fits of anger and resorted to, quote, intemperate language. One of the commanders that's specifically going to give Meade reason to use maybe some unfavorable language here at the first offensive of Petersburg on the 18th is Gouverneur K. Warren. We're going to talk about Warren a fair amount tonight. There's a moment on this attack against the Confederate line at Petersburg here on the 3rd day on the 18th, where Meade wants Warren to pitch in with the 5th Corps at noon. He's given him specific instructions, attack at noon in cooperation with these other Union Corps. And Warren, as has become very customary, hesitates. He suggests that maybe not noon, let's in fact attack at 3 o'clock. And he sends Meade this suggestion to delay an attack at 3. Meade writes a letter back to Warren under no confusion, no ambiguity. He says, I'm greatly astonished at your dispatch. What additional orders to attack you require, I cannot imagine. My orders have been explicit. They are now repeated. That you each immediately assault the enemy with all your force, and if there is any further delay, the responsibility and the consequences will rest with you. Incredibly powerful language. Meade is becoming increasingly frustrated with Warren, and we're going to see this issue come to a head in just a couple days. At the end of the day, after the sun is set on June 18, Meade will report to Grant that although these attacks were made with courage and much sacrifice, it is a source of regret that I am not able to report more success. But every effort has been made. And then the question is, what comes next? And 10 minutes later, Meade will have his reply in hand. The lieutenant general says, we will rest the men and use the spade for their protection until a new vein can be struck. The first offensive at Petersburg, those 3 days of fighting, will cost the Union Army about 11,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. So it's an incredibly forceful, vigorous series of attacks that fail to break the Confederate position or capture Petersburg. And when Grant says, now we will rest and use the spade for their protection until a new vein can be struck, that's going to be the dynamic around Petersburg until April 2nd of 1865. I want to remind you, and we talked about this last month when we did the Overland Campaign, I want to remind you how different the Army of the Potomac is here at Petersburg. How different the Army of the Potomac is in June 1864 than it was a year ago when Meade took command on the eve of the Gettysburg Campaign. The Army of the Potomac, the relentless pace of the Overland Campaign, has exhausted its men and its leaders. And Meade writes about this. He has conversations with Grant about it. Here he is writing a letter back home on June 24, lamenting Another inconvenience we suffer is from the loss of superior officers. We cannot replace these men. There is no time for reorganization or careful selection. Here's who Meade is working with. Horatio Wright, top left, Baldy Smith, top right, of course, Ambrose Burnside, bottom right, and the trusted, capable Winfield Scott Hancock on the bottom left. During the 3 days of fighting in the first offensive at Petersburg, the Army of the Potomac lost 16 regimental officers and 14 brigade commanders. Irreplaceable. So it's being pushed, the Army of the Potomac is being pushed to its absolute limits of human endurance. And in that, now back to Warren. In that, we need to talk about high command controversy. We need to talk about the Warren dispute. The short story is that Warren has been a bit problematic for Meade really since the Wilderness. Warren has a tendency to question orders rather than implement them. And we saw that with this incident I just explained at Petersburg, and we looked at Meade's reply. What other orders do you want? I can't imagine. So on June 20, General Meade will visit Warren at his headquarters. And what exactly is said between the two men can only be speculated. But we know with absolute certainty that the conversation was explosive on both sides. Meade is so outraged now by Warren's performance, combined with whatever exchange was said at his headquarters tent here on the 20th, that as he walks out from this conversation with Warren, Meade has made the decision to relieve Gouverneur K. Warren, the hero of Little Round Top, from command. He later writes to Warren stating that explicitly. I felt deeply wounded by the tone and tenor of your conversation on that occasion and fully determined upon leaving you to apply to have you relieved. So the next day, Meade is back at Army headquarters. He writes a letter to John Rawlins, Grant's chief of staff. It's 9 pages long, 9 pages, in which Meade very specifically articulates Warren's shortcomings in detail. And he finds Warren, I just sort of summarized one of the better characteristics or sort of complaints that Meade has in that third quote there. Meade says, Warren consists in too great reliance on his own judgment and in an apparent impossibility on his part to yield his judgment so as to promptly execute orders. He attributes him to being bold and audacious. He admits that he personally likes Warren, but he simply cannot do what I want him to do. So here's a 9-page testimonial to that. As you know, and this is very interesting, Meade writes this letter, but he never follows through with it. And for the short time being, at least for the next 9 months, Gouverneur K. Warren will continue to retain his command. We might chat later on in the Q&A about why Meade doesn't follow through and why he doesn't ask for Warren to be relieved of command. He's drafted the letter up. Obviously, he's given this great thought. Why he keeps him. I think the answer to this is quite simple. Warren is, at this time, the most senior in-command corps commander in terms of longevity, even more than Winfield Scott Hancock, because Hancock spends so much time after the Gettysburg wound on July the 2nd recovering. So as difficult and as mercurial as Warren is, he provides Meade with seniority and stability. And I think for that reason, Meade decides to keep him, at least for the time being. The Second Petersburg Offensive I really only had a few comments on, because I want to use the balance of my time, really like the sort of the bigger finales, to talk about the third Union offensive, which is in many ways more interesting, and Meade has a much bigger role in it. But we need to get there by talking about the second offensive. Same map, so you see continuity in my maps. June 22nd to June 24 is the second offensive at Petersburg. This is going to be an effort to secure the Weldon Railroad. And if y'all look at Petersburg to the center, here's the Weldon Railroad. This railroad runs south from Petersburg to Weldon, North Carolina. And from Weldon, North Carolina, another rail line runs east to Wilmington, major port city for the Confederacy. So disrupting the Weldon Railroad, destroying it, securing it is a major logistical success. It would be for the federal forces. Mostly the efforts here in the third week of June are unfulfilled, pretty disappointing, and that's going to lead Grant to come back to Weldon Railroad in August of 1864, which is the fourth Petersburg offensive, and it is in August that the Federals are able to really hamstring Weldon Railroad. And since we just talked about Gouverneur K. Warren, in the fourth offensive, Gouverneur K. Warren performs very well at the Battle of Weldon Railroad, or you can see on the map, also called Globe Tavern. If you're in the Army of the Potomac, this is a pretty demoralizing time for you. It's a pretty demoralizing time. Mentally, physically exhausted. Charles Wainwright, the famous artillerist, says, never has the Army of the Potomac been so demoralized as at this time. Charles Francis Adams, Massachusetts soldier, says, never before have I seen the Army so haggard and worn, so worked out and fought out, so dispirited and hopeless. It's tough going for the rank and file and the officers in the Army of the Potomac. It's tough going for Meade. And managing the operations around Petersburg obviously consume the bulk of his time, but there's other things going on in Virginia operationally, strategically, that are going to impact Meade. Think of the Civil War in 1864 in Virginia with me for a second, up into Maryland, the Battle of Monocacy. Think about Robert E. Lee detaching Jubal Early and sending Early through the Shenandoah Valley over to Monocacy, the Battle of Maryland, hoping to threaten Washington, D.C., later moving to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and sack the city. It's going on at the same time as the siege of Petersburg. Grant's going to decide to detach the 6th Corps from the Army of the Potomac. So Horatio Wright's Corps is going to go deal with Jubal Early. That's a big component of the Army of the Potomac that Meade has just seen gone, sent elsewhere. Other ways that the fight in the Shenandoah Valley, the threatening of Monocacy, the Battle of Monocacy impact Meade is a conversation about needing a unified administrator, like one person to command what is now being called the new military division. So basically all these federal soldiers around DC, they need some unified command structure. Who's going to do that? And there's a period of time where Meade's name is being considered. Grant recommends him. He's discussing Grant having Meade take this role with Lincoln and the Lincoln administration. Meade hears about this. He thinks he might like this new role. He writes to his wife, so far as having an independent command, which the Army of Potomac is not, I would like this change very well. He writes a lot about whether or not he's going to get this new position. The situation is going to be resolved, as you know, when Grant will have Sheridan appointed to command the new military division. And Meade will absolutely lament this decision. He will spend a fair amount of emotional energy. It's quite obvious in his letters, thinking about how he was slighted for this particular post and the implications of that. So that's a factor in Meade's mind. It's also pretty clear to me that Meade's relationship with his subordinates at various levels is becoming very volatile. You can read through, and I've given you just two examples of men's letters, their diaries, who have pretty intimate connections with Meade in headquarters staff, writing about how volatile Meade is, how temperamental, sort of short-fused he's becoming. Marcina Patrick, the man in the image, provost marshal, knows Meade for a long, long time from when they were together at West Point, says Meade shows himself to be what he really is, a very mean man, and there's a great deal of dissatisfaction in the Army about him. Cyrus Comstock from Grant's staff, Meade is a bear to his subordinates. I've heard him abuse Burnside, Hancock, and Warren to their faces. Very emotionally turbulent time for General Meade. Very emotionally turbulent time for him. And in the midst of this volatility or turbulence in the high command, you have a war to fight. Right? He's worried about how his image is being portrayed in the northern media. He's worried about Sheridan being unjustly promoted to command this new district in the Shenandoah Valley. He has rows with Warren. He's thinking about having him dismissed from command. All this is going on at the same time. I am tasked with how I can defeat the Confederate Army, my primary objective. And so I want to spend this last batch of slides, and I'm mindful of my time too, because I want to give you all opportunity for Q&A, to talk about the Crater, the third federal offensive. This, maybe more than the other two, first and second offensives, are familiar, more familiar in the Civil War narrative because it breeds this exciting, innovative opportunity to break the Confederate line by blowing it up. I've been interested in the Crater for a long, long time. One of my chapters in my master's thesis many, many years ago was on the Crater. I've been interested in this fight for a long time. Colonel Henry Pleasance, a miner from Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, near All Y'all's area up in PA, has an idea to mine underneath the Confederate position. They successfully do that. They will construct a mine that's 510 feet, a couple inches, blow up the Confederate position, which they will do successfully, and then you mate it with a massive infantry assault, and that will be led by the 9th Corps. Meade gives approval to go ahead and do this operation, the mining part of it, gives his consent for it, and on July 28th, Meade is going to hear from Burnside that the mine is ready to go. The black powder is being put in position, 8,000 pounds of black powder, and all the groundwork has been laid. So if you look at the map, if you can find the 9th Corps right in the center, this is where the explosion in the mine is going to be. Smashed right through those Confederate breastworks. Grant is on board with this. Grant has used mining operations in the Western Theater, so he's absolutely giving this his approval. But Grant initially sees the mine as the secondary operation. And I just want to mention quickly where Grant is really aiming to exploit Confederate vulnerability is at Deep Bottom. And if y'all look on the map with me, you can see Richmond in the top left. But look south, and where the James River makes a pretty sharp horseshoe bend is Deep Bottom. And Grant will send Winfield Scott Hancock, the 2nd Corps, and he will send elements of Federal cavalry Sheridan is still in Virginia at this time, operating here outside of Richmond, Petersburg, to hit the Confederate left. Short story is this operation doesn't bring the success that Grant wants, but this is how it's important for the crater. It does force Lee to pluck Confederate units from the entrenchments at Petersburg and send them north to the James, north of the James. It forces Lee to weaken his line at Petersburg and send those Confederate units up to deal with the Federal attack at Deep Bottom. So I say that to say, when the crater, the explosion, and here's Burnside, the 9th Corps attack will happen on the morning of July the 30th, the Confederate line has been weakened because of this operation at Deep Bottom. The Confederates are holding 9-10 miles of entrenchments. They had 6 divisions in their ranks, and now they have 3. So they have weakened their line quite considerably, which means opportunity. July 29, orders from Army headquarters. Burnside will spring his mine at 3:30 in the morning. Assault columns will move rapidly upon the breach, seize the crest in the rear, and effect lodgment there. Burnside, you can read this in the official records, provides Meade with a very, very detailed plan of what he wants his 9th Corps men to do. Very detailed. Meade will modify Burnside's plan in 2 important ways. The first modification comes in the way of which 9th Corps division will lead the attack. Burnside earmarked the guy on the left, Brigadier General Edward Ferrero, to lead the attack. Ferrero commands a division of USCT units, United States Colored Troops, relatively unengaged, certainly not battle-worn like his other white divisions have been from earlier offensives at Petersburg. It makes sense to use Ferrero. This is part of Burnside's plan. Burnside will visit Meade at his headquarters on July 28th, 2 days before the explosion is to take place. They have a conversation about what unit will spearhead the attack, and Meade says no to having Ferrero in the USCT unit lead the attack. Burnside pushes back. Meade says, okay, fine, let me run this up the chain of command. I'm going to take it to Grant. We'll see what Grant says. Grant will support Meade's decision. And the consequences of this are significant, right? Burnside is so distraught over plucking Ferrero from leading the attack that by any reasonable measure of success, a bad decision, any reasonable measure would say this is a bad decision. He will have his 3 white division commanders pick straws to see who leads the attack. And you might know this story. The short straw is picked by James Ledley, who will perform absolutely horribly in the fight at the crater, with allegations of drunkenness and not being involved in the attack at all. Meade's going to be criticized a bit for this decision, and he will later defend it just a week later, saying, it wasn't that I was in any way racially prejudiced against the USCT units, it's simply that his men hadn't been under fire. And I didn't feel like an important operation like this should be made by green troops. I want someone that is more dependable. That's his first modification. The mine explodes at 4:45 a.m. 4:45 a.m. This is a sketch. You're familiar, I suspect, with this story. The mine blows a hole about 150 yards wide in the Confederate line. It's striking a part of the Confederate line called Elliott's Salient, held by the brigade commander Elliott in the Confederate line. And historians will estimate, looking at the numbers, that about 25% of the Confederates at the salient are casualties by the mine explosion. If you visit this today, it might not look all that impressive. So much has changed in the last 160 years, erosion, topography, but it is a tremendous, tremendous achievement, the explosion of the mine. And now all this chaos, disruption, confusion, all the federal infantry has to do is exploit it. All you have to do is exploit it. About 1,200 men, Confederate men, hold this position. And Meade is going to pitch in about 10,000 Union soldiers. About 10,000. The second modification that Meade makes to Burnside's original plan is where the infantry is to go. Burnside wanted his infantry to get to the crater and fan out. He delegated some units to move to the left, some units to move to the right, and basically seal the gap. That way his men wouldn't be subjected to enfilading fire. So hit to the breach, move to the left and the right, seal the gap. Meade changes that order so that the Federal soldiers push to the crater, through it. He says there's no value in holding it, and move beyond. Ultimately, they're supposed to get to a position behind the crater, Cemetery Hill, as it is, like not, of course, to be confused with Cemetery Hill, Gettysburg, but Cemetery Hill behind the Confederate line is what they're to head to. So Meade wants them to rush for the crest. And the problem with this is it's so poorly communicated through Burnside to his infantry officers that, you're familiar with this story, the Union soldiers get up to the crater, and rather than rushing through it or fanning out around it, they move into it. And more men are going to be piled into the crater. And pretty soon, you're going to just have a massive menagerie, a sea of humanity, a sad scene in the crater here on the morning of July the 30th. Now, to my final sort of couple points. Meade's relationship with Burnside is absolutely going to deteriorate. Meade is not happy with how Burnside is communicating with him. Burnside has moved his headquarters to the front. Meade has moved his army headquarters to Burnside's old 9th Corps headquarters. And Burnside's not keeping Meade informed. He gets messages in fits and starts. One of the messages that Burnside sends says, "My men are doing everything they can to seize Cemetery Hill. It's hard work. We hope to accomplish it." Meade's reply, "What do you mean it's hard work? I do not understand. Not a man has advanced beyond the enemy's line, which you occupied immediately after exploding the mine." And this is important. The next line, Meade says, "I wish to know the truth, and I desire an immediate answer." Burnside gets that message and is furious. He will reply to Meade back, and in his reply, he says, "Were it not insubordinate, I would say that the latter remark of your note was unofficer-like and ungentlemanly." Meade does not like the tone of Burnside's reply. He follows up and says, "I want the original message," meaning I'm going to bring up some kind of charges against you. The unofficer-like and ungentlemanly claim that Burnside says here in the morning of July the 30th will be a source of tremendous rupture and dispute between these two men. It is by the case, certainly by late morning, it's quite clear that the federal troops, the 9th Corps in particular, are not going to be able to really gain any success at the crater. The Confederates later in the day will counterattack. This is Mahone's division. You might be familiar with that. There are USCT troops in the crater by then, which leads to some murdering or massacring of Ferrero's men. and the crater's absolute sea of humanity. Orlando Wilcox, division commander, says there are too many troops in the crater, too many. They crowded in upon each other until they got all mixed up. Meade is going to consult with Grant, going to get some, bits and drabs of information from Burnside from the front, and ultimately he's going to decide to suspend the attack at the crater. He's going to decide to cancel it. Getting the Federal infantry out of the crater is a very complicated task. Burnside has 55 regiments in the 9th Corps, 55. He has committed 39 of them to the crater. There are approximately 10,000 Federal soldiers in the crater, no more than 500 yards wide. It's a sea of humanity. Any sense of command and organization and control is absolutely evaporated. Now Meade wants them to pull out. So as they're pulling out, right, that depends on the enemy not attacking you, and that's when Mahone counterattacks. But what I wanted to share, because this is about Burnside, when Burnside does send messages back to Meade, this is going to be the next day, Burnside basically is out of communication for about 22 hours. Meade hears nothing from Burnside for about 22 hours. Meade's furious. Finally, the next day, July 30, Burnside is going to send Meade messages. And the one that he sends at 9 o'clock in the morning is, the order to retreat caused great confusion. We have lost largely in prisoners. He says about 4,500 men are prisoners of war. And he says the great proportion of which was made after brigade commanders in the crater were made aware of the order to withdraw. So the implication is you, commanding general, are responsible for this. This order to withdraw, Burnside was absolutely vehemently opposed to withdrawing. And by saying and phrasing in this way, it shifts the responsibility to Meade. And that's exactly how Meade interprets it. Blame from Burnside to Meade. Grant will famously consider this day the saddest affair he has ever witnessed in the war. The Army of the Potomac will lose, numbers are kind of fudgy here, 3,798 men in the effort to crater, most of whom are going to be in Burnside's 9th Corps. Then the question is, who to blame? Who to blame? Immediately, finger pointing, scapegoating, plenty of blame, all going around. Burnside, Ferrero, Ledley, the USCT soldiers, Meade, Grant, everyone that has a hand in it by someone is blamed for the fiasco at the crater. We are talking about Meade. Meade has no doubt who is to blame for the fight at the crater. July 31st. The affair was very badly managed by Burnside and has produced a great deal of irritation and bad feeling. And then, very simply, either he or I has got to go. What I want to end with is what happens after the crater. This is important for Meade. Two things. One, Meade is going to ask for a court of inquiry, meaning I want a military court to investigate the crater. And on August the 1st, Special Orders 205 will authorize a court of inquiry. The president of the court of inquiry, Winfield Scott Hancock. Think of this timing. The Battle of the Crater is 2 days ago. There are still wounded Federal soldiers. This is a mess. The dead need buried, wounded need medical care. And Meade has shifted his attention for a court of inquiry. The court will meet August through early September. Early September, it issues its finding, and it will absolutely exonerate Meade. The court of inquiry says the person responsible for the failure at the crater, Ambrose Burnside in the 9th Corps. Why does Meade want a court of inquiry? Why do this? Obvious. Meade is seeking to clear his reputation. Once the Northern public learns about the fiasco at the crater, it is just calls and cycles, vicious reporting in the newspaper of Meade to be relieved of command. I give you an example. The Evening Telegraph, August 3rd, 1864. Look at the line. Removal of General Meade. General Hooker is his successor. Meade's been through this before. Gettysburg, the pursuit. He's heard this before. He's seen his name tarnished in the newspapers any number of times. And here's his opportunity to put together a court of inquiry to investigate the crater and show that it wasn't his fault that the Army lost. New York Daily Herald, August 4th. My God, look at the language on this. The general who permits his enemy to get away under such circumstances is an idiot. Yet Lee got away, he's talking about Gettysburg, and therefore General Meade ought to have resigned then. For no patriot ought to be satisfied while a man who had so nearly proven his idiocy was in command of his country's finest army. So the New York Daily Herald is pulling back from Gettysburg, the pursuit, the golden opportunity, and Andy Waskey said Meade's pursuit is brilliantly executed. Absolutely. I'm so tired of that conversation that Meade did not pursue. He absolutely did. And now they're using that as an excuse to relieve him of command here in the summer of 64. Meade's reading all this, and look what he writes to his wife. I almost begin to wish they would relieve me. I'm beginning to be tired of this constant abuse and falsehood. So let's close the loop on Burnside. Court of inquiry, second thing that happens for Meade is Meade will issue papers to have Burnside relieved from the Army of the Potomac. On August the 13th, Burnside will leave on a 30-day leave. He will never again return to the Army of the Potomac, never see field command for the duration of the Civil War. Of Meade's sentiment on this, he says, I don't care where he goes, so as he is not in my army. And the real source of that rupture is the unofficer-like statement. Meade just cannot envision a world that he can work with Burnside any longer. And I'll encourage you to just reflect back to Meade wanting to get Warren relieved of command. So Meade has had really contentious, volatile relations with his top subordinates, corps commanders, during this period of time. And the Ninth Corps, it will be John Park who takes command in the Ninth Corps. So let me leave you with this. We've marched through 3 offensives at Petersburg, and I talked a lot, maybe more than you'd prefer, but I'll leave you with this quote. I always like to end with a Meade quote. August the 6th, let us keep up our spirits, have brave hearts, trust in God's mercy and goodness, and believe that so long as we try to do our duty, all will be well in time. So a very difficult period for General Meade, but hopefully you understand a little bit about his circumstance and situation in these opening fights at Petersburg in the summer of 1864. I'm going to stop share. I'm going to come back and join all y'all, and I'm anxious to hear what kind of questions you might have about Meade and his leadership here at the fight around Petersburg.
Well, first one we have Ken. You raised your hand. Lieutenant Colonel
Yes,
Ken Catta from Florida.
okay. Yes, I recall from the last lecture that there was a deal of friction between Meade and Sheridan. I'm wondering, looking at the initial map that you had of the campaign at Petersburg, a great deal of the Confederate line was unmanned fortifications. Was federal cavalry used to scout those positions? And if so, why was not an attack made there using Sun Tzu, where you attack the enemy where they're not?
So you mentioned the map, so I wanted to put it back up.
Yeah,
so we can...
there's a great deal of space here, and I'm wondering why an attack was not made in the southern part of the fortifications, you know, where you attack where the enemy isn't.
Yeah. That's a great comment and great observation. And the short answer is there is. There is a federal cavalry raid against the Jerusalem Plank Road, which we can see the little tip of it here, and Weldon Railroad in mid-June. That's actually part of the second Petersburg offensive, where federal cavalry will do exactly as you're suggesting, like move further south and west and try to capture the Jerusalem Plank Road and the Weldon Railroad. And this is Grant's plan, move as far north as you can to get up here in these unmanned works and extend to the Appomattox River. That's what, and I only put one slide in it, that's really what the second Petersburg offensive is. And it's incredibly ambitious. And the short story to it is the Union Army infantry or Sheridan's guys are not able to achieve the objectives that Grant wants. That's the Wilson Cats, I think it's Kautz raid, where they take some cavalry forces from the Army of the James, they augment Sheridan's command, and they do this big ride around. And it's kind of an embarrassment. There's a significant amount of them that are captured along the way, and they don't achieve what Grant wants. But that's Petersburg Offensive number 2.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I'm looking forward to your book.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for the question.
Jim Lynch has raised his hand. Jim, lower the thing so we can see your face.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. What did I do?
No,
I
that's
don't know.
okay.
Okay.
Just ask the
Anyway, I'm
question.
sorry, but thank you very much. Very, very interesting discussion. Do you know? Is there any literature on Grant's reaction to the controversy between Meade and Burnside?
Oh man, great question. That's a great question. I've looked for stuff like that, and I've looked for Burnside specifically. I've looked to sort of see what Grant might be thinking about Warren, and I've not found anything that has really shed light on Grant's thinking on this. He seems, whether willingly or unwillingly, to be aloof or ignorant from it, at least that he doesn't intervene in any way. He doesn't intervene in any way. And, Grant has his own problems. I see someone in the chat had made a comment to, was it Ben Butler? Baldy Smith is problematic in this time also, specifically with Grant. So there's a lot of turmoil in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James at this high command level. And we don't really have a good book on that. Some of you might have Stephen Sears, his book, Lincoln's Lieutenants. And Sears gets into this a little bit, but not in the depth that we need. Like, we need to understand these personality dynamics, what Grant says, how he intervenes, does he, and not, doesn't seem like he does, and the implications of this. We can speculate the implications of these kind of family feuds. Obviously, they impact operations, but understanding that is really central. And for me, George Meade is at the center of a lot of these controversies. That's a great, great question. And I wish we had more. I wish we had more.
John Sullivan. John?
I'm going to read to you from Hymns of the Republic by S.W. Gwynn regarding G.K. Warren. Major General Governor Kemble Warren, a man with a wonderful elaborate name, who at 34, the youngest corps commander in the Army of Potomac. He was considered by many who knew him to be a horse's you-know-what. Grant saw him as an officer most likely to replace Meade if such a change necessary.
Yep.
At Gettysburg, he had set the Union defenses at Little Round Top, emerged as one of the battle's heroes. He was calm under fire, fierce in combat, serious to the point of being somber, serially intelligent. He had flourished in spite of a deeply eccentric, and many would say deeply flawed personality. Though his solemnly attire and abstract manner reminded some of the absent-minded professor, nothing about him was benign. He was
John, got to give a chance to other people.
And then one last thing. The Provost Marshal of the Army of Potomac called him loathsome, profane, ungentlemanly, and disgusting. And the question is, how did someone described that be considered Meade's replacement by Grant? I mean,
yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. You're right. Grant says that in his memoirs. He talks about Warren fairly extensively. He talks about Warren during the war, and you're absolutely right. This is going to be, should anything happen to George Meade, this is the replacement for Meade as Gouverneur K. Warren. That said, Grant absolutely realizes his shortcomings. And in the Overland Campaign, this is during the fight at the Wilderness, and it escalates again at Spotsylvania, Grant gave Meade the latitude to dismiss Warren. So there's times when Warren's sort of on the precipice, he's on thin ice. And we talk a lot, the other thing I like about what you read, we talk about Meade's temperament and this snapping turtle moniker and how volatile Meade is, but Warren would match him, fit for fit. So it's an interesting relationship, to be sure, and Meade's decision not to push those papers through to Rawlins and relieve him of command here on June 2021 is incredibly important. But I think the reason, and I have no evidence of this because Meade doesn't explicitly say, when tempers cool, who is going to replace Warren? Who? Charles Griffin? I mean, who are you going to put in command of the 5th Corps that has the seniority and experience of Gouverneur K. Warren? I don't think there are a lot of options, and for that very simple reason, I think he sits on the papers and keeps Warren in command. Yeah, it's so interesting. So much good stuff going on in this part of the war. Thank you for that comment.
I have to ask, let me take the liberty to ask a question. You're running tours on World War I. Do you see comparable attacking one point as they did in World War II, World War I rather, where they keep attacking the line and people keep dying? And the same thing with Petersburg, where they keep attacking?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is yes. Certainly, the technology and the way in which men can kill one another has become so much more advanced come 1916 and 1917. But walking around World War I battlefields like the Somme and Verdun, which are just geographically, numerically so much bigger than what we see here in the Civil War, just shapes my perception on how I think about the American Civil War. And Grant says, I didn't put this quote in my slide, but he will write a message to Meade, and I'm paraphrasing it. He says, these fights at Petersburg show us that fortifications can be held virtually unmanned. And think about that. He's recognized finally the power of fortifications. And I didn't want to move through all 9 Petersburg assaults tonight because we'd be here for a long, long time and you would not be probably all that happy with me. But subsequent Petersburg assaults are focused on the Weldon Railroad, the question that was just asked, and the Jerusalem Plank Road. So what's Grant going to do? I'm done with these frontal assaults against an entrenched position. Let's attack the supply lines. And the 4th Petersburg offensive goes to the Weldon Railroad. Let's look at logistics. Let's get to the Confederacy that way. So he's learned. He's learned. That's the short of it. He's learned. Good question.
Guys, we're running, it's 8:30, so I'll take, maybe you could pick out one of the questions in the chat that you see there.
Yeah, I'll see if I can combine 2 of them because there's quite a bit about Sheridan. Meade is passed over for Sheridan to command because his name is suggested. William B. Franklin's name is also suggested, who we haven't heard of really since Fredericksburg. He's suggested. Lincoln says that he feels that moving Meade from commanding the Army of the Potomac, the army that he led and won the Battle of Gettysburg, to this secondary theater in Virginia would have been seen as a demotion. It wouldn't look good in public relations. Let's use a modern term. The optics of it would not look good. So for that reason, Lincoln avoids picking Meade. I think, and some of you might disagree, I think Sheridan's the better choice. I'm not imposing 2024 judgment on it, but if you know how the Valley campaign progresses, you need someone that is bold and audacious and a quick thinker. And looking at the way Meade operates in the fall of '63, I'm not sure that his leadership style would have transferred so nicely to the Valley, what the Valley needed in the fall of '64. Now, here's what's interesting. Let me combine that with the question below on the chat. What I like about Meade is he writes about something like, oh, I really want this command. It's going to be an independent. It gets me out of the thumb of Grant. I'm under a false position. I really want this. Then 2 letters later, it's, I don't want this. I don't care who they pick. I don't want the pressure. I don't want the micromanaging from Halleck. And it can be tricky as a historian to say, do I take what he's saying at face value? You know, why does he sort of have these diabolical conversations or points of view on this? I think it's interesting. I think in some ways he tempers himself for disappointment, and we can empathize, we can sympathize with that for why. And at the end of the day, he gripes, and then he just kind of accepts it. His relationship with Sheridan, we talked about this last month, is never harmonious. Never. Those 2 men from the get-go are at odds with one another. Sheridan is as irascible and fiery as Meade or as Warren, and they're never able to work harmoniously together. So Meade will write begrudgingly a lot about Sheridan and his success, quite frankly, and that will be the case through the end of the war. But it's a very interesting moment for Meade and sort of the culture of the Army of the Potomac and the war in Virginia. This is absolutely critical, these final months here in Petersburg.
When I just want to, when I made my statement, that was the first time I looked at the clock and it's 8:30. So, and I thank you for that. That time went fast.
Rich, I put in a fast question, which is, what's the best strategy for Meade? Grant had his gamble at Vicksburg. Sherman had his march to the sea. Porter had his incredible figuring out that the guns were stuck in the mud at Vicksburg. What is his #1 strategic breakthrough, you think?
And then we'll end it here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess each of them are, each of those examples you pose are signature victories, but I think Meade's leadership at Gettysburg is unsurpassed, particularly on July the 2nd, and his execution of the pursuit is unrivaled. Absolutely unrivaled.
What on July 2nd?
No, Eric, I want to end it. I think we got our answer there. It's more than 8:35, and people are starting to drop off.
All right, thank you, Colonel.
All right. Before we leave, again, thank you. Great lecture. And next month, on the 28th, Jeff Hunt is coming in, continue on with Meade. So we really had some great programs through here. And again, thank you.
Great. Thanks, y'all.
Well,
thanks for having me.